task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
12. Racial terrorism. Discussing Chapter 3, Racial Terror, white Americans used racial terror and vigilante violence to prevent African Americans from moving into white. The police often did not investigate or failed to arrest the perpetrators when crosses were burned on lawns, homes were bombed, and black homeowners were murdered. 490. F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and George W. Bush all lived in neighborhoods or homes with racially restrictive covenants. The home that George W. Bush bought in 2008 was located where the neighborhood association enforced a racially restrictive covenant until 2000. Elsewhere in the country, white Californians used violence to enforce the racial hierarchy created during slavery by preventing African Americans from moving into desirable white neighborhoods. 491. In fact, violent incidents in California rose in the 1950s and 1960s, after courts declared restrictive covenants unenforceable. 492. Ku Klux Klan terror and violence reached a peak in the Los Angeles area in the spring of 1946. 493. All the KKK meetings were banned in California in May 1946 after the murder of the Short family who had been living in Fontana, California. As discussed in Chapter 3, Racial Terror, the ban had little to no effect because no one enforced it. 94 of the 27 KKK actions, e.g., cross burnings, fires, and threatening letters and phone calls, documented in Los Angeles in 1946, more than half occurred after the issuance of the ban. 495. In a span of 2 weeks in May 1946, there were 4 separate actions, ranging from cross burnings to severe physical beatings. 496. 1. Targeted at a black family that lived in an all-white neighborhood, and the others were targeted at other individuals who advocated against restrictive covenants. 497. Law enforcement and the mayor shrugged off the violence as prank. 498. When concerned residents and members of social justice organizations approached the mayor to address the incidents, the mayor accused them of prejudice against the KKK. 499. Los Angeles continued to be the epicenter of the violence in California, as black residents who moved into white neighborhoods were met with cross burnings, bombings, rock throwing, graffiti, and other acts of violence. Of the over 100 incidents of move-in bombings and vandalism that occurred in Los Angeles between 1950 and 1965, only one led to an arrest and prosecution. 501. Los Angeles was not the only area where the KKK attacked black homeowners. In 1946, for instance, a home built by a black war veteran was burned down in Redwood City after threats and move-out demands. In 1952, in the White Bay Area neighborhood, a black family became the target of death threats, violence, and intimidation by white residents after the family refused to buy out of their home. 503. A KKK cross was placed on their lawn, and a 300 to 400 person mob stoned their home and shouted threats. 504. Though the action happened in front of law enforcement, officers refused to make any arrests. 5. Even when the governor, attorney general, and local district attorney ordered the city police and county sheriff to provide the family with protection, protests and harassment continued for months without any arrests. 106. And in the 1950s, the weekend home of a San Francisco NAACP leader was mysteriously burned down. 7. The violence and subsequent silence surrounding the crimes committed against black Californians demonstrates how white Californians viewed black presence and homeownership as a threat to white dominance. 508. Housing segregation today. Housing segregation and its effects have never been eliminated in the United States. 509. The racist housing policies and practices of the federal, state, and local governments have amplified private action and continue to shape the American landscape today. 510. Although residential segregation between black and white Americans in the United States peaked between 1960 and 1970, 511. America is about as segregated today. African Americans as it was in 1940. 512 By contrast, in 2010, the typical white person in a metropolitan region lived in a neighborhood that was 75% white. 113 Even though white areas have become less solidly white since 1980, they have not become significantly more black. 114 Today, 90% of African Americans live in cities, 515 and 41% of the black population of American metro areas live in city neighborhoods that are majority black. 516. California, William Bailey and Roger Duncan look at the wreckage in Bailey's living room after a bomb exploded in the house. Duncan's house, directly across the street, was also bombed at the same time, and a note was left threatening all the black families on the street if they didn't move out. 1952. Courtesy of Los Angeles Daily News UCLA Library Digital Collections. Segregation is more intractable than other forms of segregation and discrimination. 117 Moving from an urban apartment to a suburban single-family home is more difficult than registering to vote, eating at a restaurant, or even being bused to nearby school, and requires potentially generations of effort. In 18, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited future discrimination, but did not fix the structures put in place by 100 years of discriminatory government policies. 519 Richard Rothstein argues that residential desegregation requires a massive effort of social engineering. 520. Such massive effort has occurred. Instead, the Supreme Court has made private lawsuits fighting housing discrimination more difficult. 521 And housing discrimination persists in new and different ways. 122 Policies that may not seem to discriminate at first glance have reinforced the structures put in place by past racist government actions. 23. Supreme Court. 1977, the Supreme Court upheld a city's denial of request to rezone a tract of land in a mostly white suburb of Chicago, which banned the construction of apartment buildings anywhere except next to a commercial area. In 24, the neighborhood in question had been zoned for single-family houses without change since 1959. In 25, this zoning ordinance had a disproportionate impact on blacks by effectively preventing lower-income residents, who were more likely to be black as compared to other Chicago area residents, from moving into the neighborhood. 526. Though the zoning decision meeting included comments from the public about the undesirability of rezoning so as to allow apartments that would probably be racially integrated, the Supreme Court decided that the city council members themselves had no discriminatory intent when it voted for the zoning ordinance. 527 With Arlington Heights and the cases that followed, the Supreme Court essentially announced a rule that in order to prove that a law, regulation, or practice is unconstitutional, plaintiffs must prove that the decision-makers intended to discriminate. 528 of Supreme Court cases has made proving current housing discrimination and erasure of the effects of old government policies of housing segregation very difficult. 529 In other words, it's very difficult to bring a successful housing discrimination lawsuit. Continued housing discrimination mortgage and housing discrimination continues in many forms today. Researchers continue to find that black residents are charged higher prices for identical units in the same neighborhood as white residents. In 30 lenders use predatory lending practices more often in minority neighborhoods than white neighborhoods. 531 Indeed, homeowners in segregated black neighborhoods are more likely to have subprime mortgages. 532. For 2008, black and Latino borrowers were 4 times more likely to receive a more expensive mortgage than white borrowers, a practice called reverse redlining. 533 Big banks across the country used reverse redlining to target communities of color with higher interest rates and fees. In 34 Before 2008, banks specifically targeted black and Hispanic homeowners to advertise toxic subprime mortgages and other predatory practices that triggered the Great Recession. 35 Black homeowners received toxic subprime mortgages at 3 times the rate of white mortgage lenders. 536. Employees of Wells Fargo Bank referred to these loans as ghetto loans, and bank supervisors targeted black zip codes because they believed that residents weren't savvy enough. 537 according to the U.S. Department of Justice in 2010, the more segregated a community, the more likely lenders targeted the homeowners for toxic loans, and the more likely the home was foreclosed. 538. America is more segregated today for African Americans than it was in 1940. Result: Black and Latino homeowners were hit particularly hard by the 2008 crisis. 539 from 2001 to 2019, the rate of Black homeownership declined 5 times as much as the homeownership rate for white families, 540 erasing all the gains made since the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. 41 homes in Black neighborhoods were more likely to be foreclosed than homes in white neighborhoods. 542 by 2011, a quarter of Black homeowners had either lost their homes to foreclosure or were seriously delinquent on their mortgages. 543. In a lawsuit against the Countrywide Mortgage Company, the Federal Secretary of Housing and Urban Development said that due to Countrywide's discriminatory practices, from Jamaica, Queens, New York, to Oakland, California, strong African American neighborhoods saw nearly 2 decades of gains reversed in a matter of not years, but months. 544. Multiple lawsuits brought by the U.S. Department of Justice. 545, and by cities like Baltimore, 546, Memphis, 547, and Cleveland, 548. The mortgage industry continues to discriminate against Black home buyers. 2019 to June 2020, Black mortgage applicants were 2.5 times more likely than white applicants to be rejected for mortgages. 549 studies continue to show that Black mortgage borrowers pay more in financing fees, 550 mortgage insurance, 551 in property taxes, 552. To white buyers, Black home buyers go into more debt for homes that are valued less. 553 Black homeowners who apply to refinance their homes are denied over 30% of the time, compared to 17% of white homeowners. 154. This makes it more difficult for Black homeowners to make necessary repairs to their homes and to move out of dilapidated homes. 555. These trends have continued even as mortgage lending has become more automated and internet-based in recent years. 556. California remains racially segregated. 557. Although Black-white segregation has decreased since 1980 in cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and Riverside. 558. There's also evidence that lenders discriminate against African Americans in California. For example, one study found that in 2019, despite making up 5% of the state's population, Black Californians received only 3.28% of home purchase loans. 559. The magnitude of this disparity varies across metro areas in the state. 560. Another study found that in 2013, Black Californians, up to 7% of all home mortgage loan applicants, received 4% of all home mortgage loans originated, and received 7% of all home mortgage loan dollars in the state. 561.